Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the second event in the online series on art and action, which as many of you will know is a series of events looking at the relationships between literary authorship, literary celebrity and politics. This series started life as a conference which we planned to hold last March, and of course that having been cancelled, we've resurrected it. It's been brought back thanks to the extraordinary hard work and patience of our speakers, to whom we're extremely grateful, and especially the hard work of Sandra Meyer and Jenny Thoyer at the University of Vienna and the Oxford Centre for Life Writing. And that's also with the very greatly appreciated help of the Austrian Science Fund, Post-Colonial Writers Make Worlds, the Stephen Spender Trust, and very especially Torch, who are our online hosts today. Our first event, which launched Asher Rogers' wonderful new book, State-Sponsored Literature, Britain and Cultural Diversity After 1945, was last week, and video of that discussion will very soon be available on the Torch website, as a recording of today's panel will be posted in the future. You can also check the art and action pages on the Torch website for further information about upcoming events in the series. It would be really great to see you there in the future. So my name, rather belatedly, is Ruth Scobie. I'll be chairing today's panel on writers as political activists. And this is the panel that in one form or another, we'd always hoped would open the conference. With those debates now more urgent than ever about the political vulnerability and the political power of the arts and humanities in fractured and turbulent societies, it seems to us more important than ever to examine these questions rigorously and with attention to historical, geographical, and cultural specificity and difference, as well as universals. So today we have 3 case studies which we hope will help to make those questions more concrete. First off, I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers, and then we'll hear the papers all together. We'll hear from all 3 speakers in turn, and then at the end, we're going to have time for plenty of questions. We'll be taking questions from the audience via Zoom's question and answer feature. So please feel free to write down any questions you've got in the Q&A at any time. So during the papers or after the papers is fine. And I'll ask the speakers on your behalf as many questions as we have time for. So I'll begin by introducing our first speaker. First paper is from Simon Morgan, the head of history at Leeds Beckett University. Simon is the co-editor of the 4-volume Letters of Richard Cobden, and also the author of A Victorian Woman's Place, Public Culture in the 19th Century, as well as numerous articles on 19th century public and celebrity culture and radical politics. He's currently completing a monograph for Manchester University Press called Celebrities, Heroes and Champions, Popular Politicians in the Age of Reform, 1810 to 1867, which I'm personally really looking forward to. His paper today is on James Vernon of South Molton, a disabled poet with radical Chartist politics, using Vernon as, quote, a case study for exploring the potentials and limitations of literary activism as a strategy for self-actualisation and empowerment in early Victorian Britain. Our second speaker is Divya A, who is Assistant Professor in English Literature in the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras. Divya has published articles on Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, Wilkie Collins, and the Pre-Raphaelites. After an MSc in Early Modern English Literature from the University of Oxford, she completed her PhD in 19th century English fiction at NTU in Singapore. Her current research projects are on Anglo-Indians, colonial texts and illustrations, and regional Indian literatures in translation. And today she'll be talking about a Tamil short story collection, Aram, by the prolific contemporary author Jeyamohan, in relation to his public persona and to cultural activism in India. And finally, we'll hear from Odile Heynders, Professor of Comparative Literature and Head of the Department of Culture Studies at Tilburg University. Odile is the author of numerous books and articles on European literature and authorship. There you are, Odile. Including in 2016, the monograph Writers as Public Intellectuals, Literature, Celebrity, Democracy. She's currently working on a project on experiences of migration in literature, and today we'll be discussing the case of the contemporary writer Valeria Luiselli and her interventions into debates over migration in the Trump era. So, as I say, we'll begin with the papers. We'll have time for questions at the end. I will hand over now to our first speaker, Simon Morgan.
Thanks, Ruth. And thanks to Sandra and Ruth for the invitation to speak, and also for their sterling efforts in resurrecting this seminar series Phoenix-like from the ashes of the Art and Action Conference. It's a great idea. Now, I first came across the subject of today's paper while researching the book that Ruth referred to, Celebrities, Heroes and Champions, hopefully eventually available from all good internet bookshops. At the time, I was looking into the way that poetry was being used by the British Chartist movement for political reform as a vehicle for celebrating and occasionally even attacking its leading figures. Of the many poets publishing this kind of laudatory verse in the poetry column of the movement's principal newspaper, the Northern Star, one in particular stood out to me. His name was James Vernon, not to be confused with the historian of the same name, who confusingly also publishes on this period. Unlike many Chartist poets, he wasn't a leader either nationally or locally, but an obscure foot soldier of the movement. Also, unlike many Chartist poets, he did not reside in one of the smoky new industrial towns that were the heartlands of the movement, but in the sleepy market town of South Molton in Devon. Moreover, he was entirely unique among the poets I considered in being severely disabled. He'd been paralysed by a progressive condition that first manifested itself in his mid-teens. And you know, this was a condition that he suffered from then on to the end of his life in 1852. Now, this paper is the first part of a project in which I'm going to attempt to place Vernon and his poetic output into the context of his time and place. I just realised I can't get off the slide, so I don't know if anybody can help me with that. Oh no, there we go. Actually, I found the relevant button to press. Okay, so in the national census of 1841, Vernon proudly recorded his profession as that of poet, an appellation which the enumerator recorded in capital letters, as you can see there. Vernon was remarkable really for two reasons. First, because of his disability, which, as well as causing him obvious difficulties in composing and publishing his work, also became a central theme of his poetic output. It was the main preoccupation of a number of autobiographical poems in his only known collection, the Afflicted Muse, which appeared in 1842. It was therefore the case that Vernon wasn't just a disabled poet, he was a poet of disability. The second remarkable thing about Vernon is that for a 16-month period between September 1840 and January 1842, he was a regular contributor to the poetry columns of the Northern Star newspaper. This despite being very much dependent on the support of the local community and the patronage of local notables for his comfort and indeed his very survival. The Northern Star was the main organ of the radical Chartist movement, which campaigned for universal manhood suffrage and became the focus of arguably the greatest sustained political mobilisation of the British working class ever seen. So my aim in this paper is really to explore Vernon's use of poetry as a medium for self-actualisation and radical political agency in an age when disabled individuals of humble origin were mostly expected to be meek and grateful recipients of community largesse and the patronage of their social superiors. Now, at first glance, a rural market town in the southwest of England was not the obvious place to spawn a radical poet, but the region wasn't entirely a political backwater. I've given you there an image there of the Ordnance Survey map of 1809, centering on South Molton. So you can see it's pretty small. It's sitting within this kind of rural hinterland. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the population statistics from 1800 to the end of the 19th century. So by 1840, which is when Vernon is starting to write for the Northern Star, there's been a sustained but relatively gradual increase of population up to about 9,500, after which it goes into gradual decline. But Devon isn't so much of a political backwater in this period. As with other parts of the United Kingdom, it became used to political meetings and lectures by Chartists and by representatives of the Anti-Corn Law League, which were agitating the rural districts, trying to build a head of steam against the Corn Laws. And there are lecturers from both those organisations passing through South Molton and delivering lectures and holding meetings through the early 1840s. Both of these organisations are selling their own panaceas for the economic hardships of a period that is later dubbed the Hungry 40s. The strength of Methodism in the region also gives a potential alternative base for resisting the default Toryism of much of rural England, while the same bookseller who later published Vernon's poetry would also have sold the Northern Star newspaper. However, as his poems reveal, before he received the gift of a wheelchair in November 1840, Vernon's life had largely been confined to the interior of the house that he shared in 1841 with 5 of his siblings, some of whom reportedly also suffered from the same medical condition as himself. As a result of this, his sphere of acquaintance was limited and his potential for making an impact on the wider world apparently zero. Through the Northern Star, however, Vernon was able to transcend his physical limitations and address something approaching a national audience. His first poem in the paper, Sonnet to Freedom, appeared tentatively under the initials JV, but by the time his third was published in December 1840, he was bold enough to use his full name. In 1841, Vernon was one of the Northern Star's most prolific contributors of poetry. Over 11% of the poems published that year, 15 out of 133, appeared under his name. On the 23rd of January, all 3 poems in the Star's poetry column were by Vernon. I've given you there the 23rd of January edition is actually a unique edition of the Northern Star and quite a celebrated one because it appears with an illustration on the front of a reform meeting that was being held in Leeds by the rival household suffrage association. So this is the Northern Star basically attacking that meeting as the fox and goose show, saying that the leaders of this organisation are foxes who are going to devour the gullible geese who come to listen to them. So it's actually quite a well-known issue, and all 3 poems in the column that day, including the one I've reproduced there, To the Incarcerated Chartists, were published in that volume. Most of the poems record South Molton as Vernon's place of residence, and several of them refer to his disability. Vernon was therefore making a very public statement of his political loyalties, a potentially dangerous strategy given his dependence on local charity and patronage. Now, since the first publication of an anthology of Chartist literature in Moscow in the 1950s, Chartist poetry has received much scholarly attention. There are 3 anthologies of Chartist poetry, including the Russian one, that include works by Vernon and contain short biographies of him. But before you run away from this seminar and think I must run off and look up information on him from these sources, please don't, because they're all completely inaccurate in their details of Vernon's life. And the 2 English anthologies erroneously conflate him with a London Chartist by the name of William J. Vernon on the basis of very little evidence, or no evidence at all, in fact. The most recent book-length study of Chartist poetry by Mike Sanders has established the central importance of poetry in Chartist subculture, where it fulfilled a number of key roles, helping to create a sense of shared experience and community, by writing about social conditions and common experiences of repression, rallying support around particular causes such as the plight of Chartist prisoners, and providing a utopian vision of the Chartist future when the People's Charter was the law of the land, corruption and despotism were banished, and all were enjoying the fruits of peace and prosperity. As I established in my own book, a further role of Chartist poetry was to exalt the virtues of Chartist leaders and martyrs, particularly individuals such as Fergus O'Connor, the dominant figure in the national movement between 1839 and 1848. Vernon himself was particularly drawn to the celebration of Chartist prisoners. For example, between October 1840 and February 1841, he published sonnets to the imprisoned O'Connor, to William Lovett and John Collins, George Binns and James Williams, plus a more general sonnet to the incarcerated Chartists reproduced on the slide. Vernon's own experience of incarceration through his illness may have given him an affinity with those Chartists imprisoned for their beliefs. For example, his sonnet on myself, dated in 1840, depicts Vernon forlorn and sated with drear solitude. I pant within my smoky, lonesome room, whose lengthy prison seems a living tomb. A major theme which runs throughout both his autobiographical and more overtly Chartist poetry is the contrast between the life of the body, in his own case, of course, clearly circumscribed by illness, and the life of the mind. In his sonnet to O'Connor, for instance, Vernon claimed that the gloomy jail may lord it o'er thy tongue, but it must fail to wield its sceptre o'er the mind, whose mood was e'er unyielding, save where justice stood, and doth o'er silence mightily prevail. In a poem simply entitled A Fragment, published in the Northern Star on the 30th of January 1841, he contrasted those who suffered poverty, but yet enjoyed ennobled mind, with those whom poverty afflicts in mind, although arrayed with proud magnificence. For Vernon, when the mind is shackled with gaunt fetters, it wears the unblotted mark of slavish bonds throughout eternity. Vernon's most vitriolic poem was one simply entitled Stanzas, which appeared in the Northern Star on 2nd of October 1841 and dated 21st of September. In it, he related a visitation that plainly tells of the risks that he was taking. A parson called on me the other day and hinted that I stood in my own light by being a reformer, which would lay my rising hopes low in the dust and blight my prospects, and by writing for that ray of truth, the Northern Star, the poor man's might, I should be left without a friend till hoary. For help, he said, was only from the Tory. Vernon went on to fulminate against the black slugs, which was an old insult for country parsons, or the black slugs who eat the people's cabbages, a reference to the tithes that rural clergymen were still entitled to demand from the produce of the land. He then claimed that he would rather muse unknown and sing unpaid than court the vicious sycophantic lay. Nonetheless, despite Vernon's angry defiance, it's possible to detect a change in the content of his poetry after this point. Not that it became sycophantic, or at least not yet. Instead, his verse began to play more on his own physical condition, and in a sonnet to the Humane and Benevolent of 4th of December 1841, he openly began to solicit funds to pay for treatment that he was now being offered in London. On the 11th of December, the newspaper recorded a donation of a shilling from H. Griffith of Edgware Road in London. Another sonnet on the treatment which it is necessary for me to undergo ere I can attain a cure appeared on 18th of December, followed by notice of a further donation of sixpence on the 24th of December. Vernon's final three poems appeared in January 1842. The first was a sonnet to his surgeon, Mr. Engel of University College, who'd apparently offered Vernon the treatment at Harrison's spinal infirmary that he was trying to fund. The second, on 15th of January, was simply entitled A Sonnet, and was effectively a plug for the poetry collection that he was working on. And his final poem on the 29th of January appealed to the poets of the Northern Star and its musical readers to further publicise his plight. The same poem also referred to his plan to print some verse for £half a crown. Subscribers lists are open at the Star. Now, to apply Robert Van Creeken's useful concept from celebrity studies, Vernon's contributions to the Northern Star poetry column gained him a modest degree of attention capital. This may have helped to bring him to the notice of surgeons in London and opened up the prospect, at least, of a cure for his condition. We can be rather more certain that Vernon was now trying to leverage his profile in the Northern Star to obtain funds for his treatment through direct donation and to support his projected volume of poetry through subscription, which is the 19th century equivalent, of course, of crowdfunding. It is equally apparent that this effort was an abject failure. 1 shilling and sixpence was a poor return in terms of donations, while a subscription list published in the Afflicted Muse reveals that the overwhelming preponderance of Vernon's around 250 subscribers were local to South Molton and its vicinity. The only identifiable reformer who subscribed was Dr. John Epps, a homeopathic doctor, member of the Anti-Corn Law League and reader of the Northern Star, whose interest in Vernon was almost certainly primarily professional. Epps's half-brother was a supporter of Harrison's infirmary, and it may have been through him that Vernon's condition had come to the attention of Engel, who also subscribed to the volume. In January 1843, the Afflicted Muse was somewhat indifferently reviewed in the Northern Star. The reviewer was probably Julian Harney, who was now the paper's literary editor and was trying to drive up the standards of poetry in its columns. And he damned it with faint praise, conceding only that the poems are not destitute of poetic merit, and though they perhaps seldom rise above mediocrity, we have seen much worse stuff than anything here to be found, most unconscionably puffed and praised by the reviews. The pieces are generally tinged with sombre hue, which, considering the writer's circumstances, is not wonderful. And this was the last mention of Vernon that I've so far been able to discover in the newspaper. Now, while the Afflicted Muse did include 10 poems previously published in the Northern Star, unsurprisingly, they did not include any of Vernon's overtly Chartist material. This was not an uncommon pattern amongst those Chartist poets who attempted to launch themselves into the wider poetic firmament. However, the collection itself does seem to represent a retreat from Vernon's earlier radicalism. The tone was set by the dedication to a local landowner, the Honourable Lady Poltimore, as pictured on the slide. In his preface, Vernon argued that his poems have not greater claim to a humane and discerning public than that they were written while labouring under accumulated disadvantages, a limited education, my being unable to write from paralytic helplessness, and the mind always burthened with a vastly decaying tenement. This was a calculated show of deserving poverty and autodidacticism, which played into the developing self-help tropes of early Victorian England and was calculated to appeal to the charitable impulses of his readers. Many of the poems actively preached a gospel of quietism and acceptance, including, for example, titles like "The Lord loveth whom he afflicteth," and "To the Right Honourable Earl Fortescue for his generous offer of sending me to London." The Afflicted Muse is Vernon's only known collection, but Vernon did continue to publish poems. In 1843, 2 poems appeared in the North Devon Journal, dedicated respectively to Queen Victoria and the Queen Dowager, in thanks for donations of £5 each towards the expenses of his treatment, while the same paper also referred to Vernon being firmly under the patronage of the local vicar. It seems that the sycophantic lay had triumphed after all. We could easily read this as selling out, but we cannot really blame Vernon. The Northern Star and Chartism had given him an opportunity to access a national audience and to develop a political subjectivity and agency, which his physical disabilities denied to him in any other way. However, as others had found before him, the trade of agitation, to use Charles Kingsley's phrase, did not always pay too well. Given his failure to raise adequate funds from the readers of the Northern Star, in the absence of a benign welfare state, and under threat of the withdrawal of patronage, he had no choice but to fall back on the more traditional and conformist route of performing deserving poverty for royalty and local bigwigs. In the census of 1851, Vernon identified himself as Devonshire poet. The territorial description may imply a retreat from earlier ambition. He could no longer realistically command an audience beyond his native county. But it also reveals his fundamental tenacity. After all, local poets were a significant feature of this period. My own corner of West Yorkshire boasted several, including Robert Dibb, the Wharfdale poet, who also published in the Northern Star. Along with pain and disability, poetry was the one constant in Vernon's life. When he died in 1852, his obituary in the North Devon Journal recorded that the deceased was well known as the writer of several poems, some of which possessed no inconsiderable merit. A backhanded compliment, but one with which I think Vernon would not have been displeased. Thank you for listening. I'm going to hand over now to Divya to take you on to the next paper.
Thank you, Simon. Many thanks also to Sandra and to Ruth for making this exciting event a reality. Now, on to my paper. In 2012, when the Tamil weekly Ananda Vigadan published top 10 book recommendations from noted authors, 6 out of 10 have recommended Jeyamohan's Aram short story collection. Aram also won the Mugam Award in 2016. Framed as a conversation between two writers, one of whom is the contemporary celebrity author of the story, Jeyamohan, the titular story performs the regressive ideological work of establishing the socio-cultural supremacy of a male from the highest caste who does writing for a living. In British colonial India, the most famous writer-activist was the Bengali author Rabindranath Tagore, who deployed his international and national literary celebrity to resist in diverse ways the hegemony of the British Empire as well as the shackles of Indian conservatism. The attention capital of Tagore was also influential in sculpting the intellectual discourse of national freedom fighters and leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, who was given the epithet of the Mahatma, the great soul, by Tagore. Historian Ramachandra Guha states that while Gandhi was the leader of nationalism and Nehru the nurturer, Tagore was the unacknowledged force behind them. Tagore argued for individual freedom from dead customs such as caste before one could fiercely seek freedom under the guise of nationalism. He exhorted, must we not have that greater vision of humanity which will impel us to shake off the fetters that shackle our individual life before we begin to dream of national freedom? In response, Gandhi was compelled to declare his vision of Indian nationalism as not exclusive, nor regressive, nor destructive. In Tamil Nadu, Subramanya Bharati, known as Mahakavi or the great poet, was hunted by the British for his revolutionary activities against the empire. A contemporary of Tagore, Bharati wrote fiery songs urging the nation to overthrow foreign oppression as well as the cultural prisons incarcerating the people of India. Bharati argued for an equality of race, nationality, creed, and even age. The literary celebrity of Bharati, who fled to the French-held Pondicherry to escape arrest by the British, began to emerge after his death, and his poetic ideals have been used to rally people against caste and gender discrimination. Observing the similarity between Tagore and Bharati, A.R. Venkatachalapati hails Bharati as Tamil Tagore, who stood for an egalitarian society, India as a nation which would accommodate everybody equally. However, Bharati also became all things to all people and was exploited by diverse outfits across the political spectrum, from the left, the right, and the reformist, to promote their ideologies in the past and present. Such a systematic desire to appropriate the poet underlines the immense value that a fiery literary celebrity possesses for effectively legitimating political and social agendas. In post-colonial India, the most acclaimed Indian writer who successfully traversed the fields of literature and political activism is Arundhati Roy. She exploited her international celebrity status in the aftermath of the Booker Prize to her first novel, The God of Small Things, to advocate publicly, first for the cause of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, a movement spearheaded by the activist Medha Patkar, which sought to protect the rights of the villagers affected by the increase in the height of the dam across the Narmada River. Moreover, through her political essays, interviews, and speeches, Roy sought to galvanize public opinion against the excesses of US foreign policy and globalization that exploited vulnerable communities. Commenting on the role of writer as an activist, Roy states that, "I never accept that added profession of being an activist because I think that reduces what writers used to be." That is a very new word, activist. And that word has been added on because the idea of what a writer is in this world today is being reduced to a commodity. It is our job to be unpopular. It's our job to stand alone and say what we really think, not as activists, but as writers. Roy argues that it is better to subvert the global nexus of capitalism and commodification in order to remain unpopular and thus stay uncompromised. David Marshall states that celebrities are intrinsic to the creation of semiotic system engaged in the representation of popular values and means of expression for mass mentality, and therefore key tools of Western liberal democracy. Roy's mistrust of celebrity culture is informed by a distrust of the politics of majoritarianism and exclusion. In contemporary Tamil Nadu, Jeyamohan is a best-selling contemporary Tamil writer, one who has made his presence felt in multiple artistic and public domains. A prolific writer, his writings span genres: novels and epic, short story collections, poetry, literary criticism, memoirs, travel writing, etc. Some of his awards are Kannadasan Award in 2014, EL Award from the Tamil Literary Garden in 2015, and Lifetime Achievement Award at the Codicia Book Festival in 2017. Jeyamohan's conservative cultural position is expressed through his controversial opinions on women writers. In 2014, Jeyamohan asserted that many women, having written nothing of merit, through their many tactics have become media creations. Today, men have to establish themselves as writers only by their fine writing. Women writers just have to put forward their female identity to get their recognition as writers. Even if slight feminist tendencies surface in their writing, many would hesitate to criticize the nature of their work, worried, why should one get into trouble in these difficult times? A statement was soon issued against the blatant misogyny of Jeyamohan, and it had 100 signatures from both male and female activists and writers, including Ambai and academicians such as Kalpana Karnagaran. The statement declared that his vicious statements against women stem from a deeply rooted patriarchal mindset that believes that men are superior. Apologizing for his comments, Jeyamohan also ironically termed those who protested against his misogyny as a gaggle of foul-mouthed female protesters. He had also hailed Arundhati Roy as superficial and exotic, blogged that her first novel is pulp fiction, and that there is a conspiracy behind the international media's celebration of this woman writer who lacked a profound historical and political awareness. Jeyamohan's assessment of one of the most iconic Indian writers, Kamala Das, also reflects his sustained sexism. A veteran writer, Kamala had won several awards, including the Kerala Sahitya Academy Award, the National Sahitya Academy Award, and the Asian World Prize for Literature. Her works are characterized by explorations into female loneliness, nostalgia for the maternal home, female liberty through sexual freedom, and what Shahnaz Habib terms the unfair privileges of caste and wealth, and the contradictions of motherhood. Her autobiography, My Story, was translated into 15 languages. Jeyamohan, on her death, assesses her character as dramatic, crazy, attention-seeking, and driven by a sexual need that was propelled by her physical ugliness. All problems of Kamala have its source in one thing: she is not a beauty. She is dark, fat, and nearly an ugly woman. She was unfortunate to be born in a family of beautiful women. Her low self-esteem led to the birth of her twisted personality. He reduces Camilla's discourse on sexuality and female liberation to her sense of disappointment over her lack of physical beauty, and thus characterizes such writing as an attribute of a distorted sense of overcompensation on the part of ugly women. However, K. Sachidanandan's critical perception of Camilla's writing is a useful contrast. Her urban women are mostly schizophrenic, torn by conflicts and desperate for real love, while her rural women, mostly drawn from the lower classes, are less inhibited and openly critical of the master race and patriarchal interventions. Jeyamohan's Aram is in the form of a framed narrative. An aged writer, M.V. Venkatram, the Periyavaru in the story, talks to his visitor, the writer Jeyamohan, giving him glimpses into his personal past, as well as the literary culture centered in Kumbakonam, a southern town in the mid-20th century India. M.V. Venkatram, hereafter referred to as MVV, is forced to choose writing as his profession when his family's lucrative silk weaving business collapses. To survive, he enters into a writing contract with a publishing house run by the Mayappan brothers. MVV rewrites books on freedom fighters to cater to the huge demand from the local schools and libraries. The idea of paying royalty to the writers was non-existent then, and MVV had to sell each of his work for a paltry sum to the publishers who made enormous profits. Complication arises when MVV writes 100 books at the cost of 5 rupees each, with his payment adding up to a total of 5,000 rupees. As is customary, Mayappan brothers pay the writer in small installments periodically, with the writer's account being maintained on a company register. When the writer requests the rest of his payment in order to make arrangements for his daughter's wedding, the publishers refuse and abuse him brutally. Vexed, the writer goes to the home of the older brother to get his wife to intercede for him. A woman of great dignity and cherished by the elder Chettiar as the guardian spirit of his home, Archie has a high regard for the writer. In helpless anger, MVV writes a poem that warns of dire divine consequences for the family if the Chettiars fail to pay him. Aghast, she forces her husband's hand by sitting on the road under the glare of the summer sun in protest, prompting him to quickly collect the necessary funds to repay the writer, and all ends happily. The literary merits and writerly significance of MVV are not sufficiently established in Aram, but the fact that he is a Saurashtra Brahmin is indicated right from the beginning. A reader would immediately notice the difference between the Tamil used in Aram by Jeyamohan, who does not speak the highest caste dialect, and MVV's Brahmin Tamil. The second key marker of MVV's unique cultural identity is the silk weaving business that is historically associated with Saurashtra Brahmins. MVV proudly declares, "We were running 4 or 5 weaving looms at home. The others did not know to work with this type. On our woven silk bloomed goddess Mahalakshmi." In a complex rhetoric, he points out that the silk woven by his community is superior, either because of the blessing of the goddess or because they can orchestrate the presence of divinity on their product due to their exquisite skill. Moreover, MVV quips that the publishers had no erudition. For them, books and vegetables are of same value, and their strategic interest in books is because of their long shelf life. Men from this caste are apparently not connoisseurs of literary taste. Richard Dyer writes that authenticity is established or constructed in media texts by the use of markers that indicate lack of control, lack of premeditation, and privacy. MVV's lack of control over his financial circumstances shackles his creativity, and a lack of premeditation in terms of his behavior with the publishers and their family construct a personality for MVV that is vulnerable but genuine. Yet the identity that is primary in Aram for MVV is his caste identity. His fiery threat towards the Chettiars, displayed before Archie, subconsciously draws on his familiarity with and implicit influence over the goddess when he declares that he is the favorite of goddess Saraswati. He tells Archie, "If you ruin my life, do you think you and your progeny would prosper? If you did indeed prosper, then Saraswati is a whore." His writerly identity is asserted to be a mark of his blessed status, and he simultaneously asserts that if he does not triumph in his battle with the publishers, then the character of the female divinity Saraswati herself would be in moral jeopardy. Further, offering a vision in terms of a genocide of her community, the religio-poetic fervor of the Brahmin is frightening. He wants, "Slaying the clan of Chetty to build red mounds, leaping ascends my right." The righteousness of the Brahmin writer is exemplified by a vision of the bloodied bodies of Chettiars, a catastrophic image that prompts Archie to intervene in her husband's business. The disproportionate and violent nature of the rhetorical punishment is disturbing and is suggestive of an angered God's punishment. The fact that Archie respects the literate man is evident from the way she addresses him as Pulavar, a Tamil word that has connotations of a literati, poet, or philosopher. Archie is unlettered, and yet she is aware of the association between the highest caste and its literary merits, thus indicating the reality that for centuries, all Indian scholarship was in the hands of the spiritual elite. In fact, during the British colonial administration, Brahmin teachers were preferred to teach in schools. Writing about the self-respect movement of the 1920s in Tamil Nadu, K. Srilata, in her book, Other Half of the Coconut, Women Writing Self-Respect History, acknowledges that the movement rose as a radical critique of Brahmin supremacy in Tamil society. When MVV refers to himself as the favorite as well as the supervisor of the goddess of learning, he is underlining his hegemonic masculinity that dominates all men and women in terms of caste, gender, and knowledge. The Chettiars had, however, believed in rampant capitalism until the crisis of the Pulavar. Their apparent liberty from caste hierarchy is offset by the sacred status that they accord to Archie, the elder Chettiar's wife. She is considered by her husband as the beacon of a clown. Jeyamohan sketches Archie along the lines of the local goddess. Her grandeur was like that of the Amman seated in the temple in the corner of the street. Had a word been uttered against her wish, she would have pounced on the jugular to drink blood. Archie, who literally resembles and figuratively embodies the character of the goddess, is deployed to come to the aid of the Brahmin writer. Her fierce physical demeanor becomes comparable to the regional or minor goddess for whom blood sacrifices are offered. The wife of the elder Chettiar commands the complete obedience of her husband, who tries to appease her as a devotee would a god. For the Chettiars, the goddess at home had apparently been more powerful than the pan-Indian caste system, which has the Brahmins at the top. While the Archie or Amman exercises power over the elder Chettiar, the Brahmin writer controls the woman or the goddess is both regional and pan-Indian, thus ultimately superseding everyone. In the ultimate assessment of MVV, the woman who seeks forgiveness and blessing from the writer is the only one with Aram or ethics. He hails her as a Dharma Patni, a wife who upholds Dharma or the right moral order. With the male Chettiar's disregard for the Brahmin, it becomes incumbent on a Chettiar woman to restore the right order and bring the prodigals back within the rules of caste and ethics. Therefore, the poet MVV perceives Archie's actions as a form of penance performed by the guiding lamp of the Chetty clan. As the beacon of the Chettiar clan, her atonement is for both her entire family and her caste. In creating a unique literary celebrity for MVV, whose powers imbricate with the gods, Jeyamohan, the writer, also becomes the guardian of conservative cultural laws in relation to caste and gender. There is thus a reverse or regressive political activism on the part of Jeyamohan in seeking to sustain and solidify existing hierarchical relationships in society. Thank you for listening. I would now hand over to Odile Heynders.
Okay, thank you everyone. Simon, Divya, it's wonderful to be here in this kind of connection between Austria and the UK and India, and I am in the Netherlands, in my home in Leiden. The slide is a bit too big for this screen, but the later slides, I think it will work better. What you see here is the book covers of three interesting books, I would say, in the context of what we are talking about. Underneath my face is the cover of a book by Ali Smith, Spring. Edouard Louis, you probably know him as a French young author, and Alessandro Berico, and all three of them are using their work, their literary work, in order to say something about today's society, about political and ethical issues. And I think that all three of them are using their work in order to reorder reality. Let me see how I get to the next slide now. This is where I would like to start. We talk about political activism today. And in this context, I would like to bring in another topic, and that is the topic of public intellectual, in order to sharpen the debate on politics, on democracy, and on literary authorship. And public intellectuals, the term as such, is used in order to point at people, to refer to people who intervene in the public sphere and who proclaim a committed and often provocative stance regarding topics of political, social, and ethical nature. Public intellectuals address non-specialist audiences on matters of general concern. They use various forms, from novels to manifestos to blog posts to essays. It is important that some public intellectuals are activists aiming to bring about social and political change, while others are more concerned about the democratic debate as such, about deliberation. If we talk about public intellectuals and activism, we talk about visibility, about performance, about public persona on the one hand, and that is the public part. And on the other hand, we talk about the intellectual input in whatever form of writing or speaking. Importantly, in today's mediatized and digitalized public spheres, writers as public intellectuals have to be visible both in online and offline contexts in order to make their point, in order to communicate to broad audiences. A new role for the public intellectual is created, one funded on cultural authority and on various forms of writing, on rational argumentation and subversiveness, while also influenced by, I quote, the vertical engagement with the public. In today's public spheres, audiences can talk back. And of course, that immediately has a consequence for authors. My main argument today is that cultural authority is an important notion in the current context of democracy fatigue, the decline of democracy, information abundance, and political activism. My statement is that political activism of literary writers is indeed a strategy for self-actualization and empowerment, that was what Simon talked about, but also a particular articulation of a political agency that, while based on aesthetic forms, underlines the cultural authority of the writer. To put this differently, in the fragmented and kaleidoscopic democratic public spheres in which we live, the function of literature and the role of the author have changed and become more urgent. I will discuss 3 cases to elaborate on this, and then I will provide further reflections on cultural authority. The first case is the political politically active Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, operating online as well as offline, and addressing a huge public on topics such as feminism, migration, and identity. Her presence online supports the writing of the novel and confirms the image of the writer as a global intellectual. On the left, we see her on her Instagram account, on which she informs about fashion issues, mostly from Nigerian designers. In the middle, you see a reference to her TED Talk in 2012. The TED Talk was on feminism, and it was enormously successful. You probably know how Beyoncé took parts of this TED Talk and used it in her Flawless song in 2013. And on the right, you cannot see it, but there is a book cover of one of her popular novels, Americana. My point is that there is a gradual scale in being visible online, in being public on a global stage, and being a celebrated, praised author. We could also say that there is a scale from celebrity persona to someone who is characterized as post-colonial, Nigerian American, Igbo, feminist, and migrant author. But all these identities come together in one and the same posture: the everyday life of a writer, the narrative of becoming and knowing where you came from, and the interrelatedness of the personal and the political. Feminism is an important message on self-esteem, on rootedness and independence in Adichie's work and life. The second example is an example that Divya already talked about, a political active Indian public intellectual, Arundhati Roy, famous for her novel in 1979, God of Small Things, famous for her political and activist notes on democracy in Listening to Grasshoppers, 2009, her second novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, and then recently My Seditious Heart, a collection of non-fiction. And in the foreword to the letter, Roy explained that after she had this enormous success in her prize-winning first novel, she started wondering what it really meant to be a writer in times such as these, and how she could sort of contribute to what was going on in India and on the globe as well. About non-fiction, her non-fiction, Roy states, "It was never meant as neutral commentary, pretending to be observations of a bystander. She challenged her abilities as a writer, and she tried to turn all sorts of political and societal topics into literature. In this case, again, we see how life, political ideas, and work are interrelated. The aim of writing is to understand and reorder the work, to be unpopular." That was a good phrase that Divya used. My third case study in this context is Mexican writer Valeria Luiselli, who wrote in 2017 the essay Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions, based on her experiences as an interpreter for undocumented child migrants who crossed the border from Mexico to the US. The essay is constructed in 40 questions asked in the intake questionnaire in the Federal Immigration Court in New York City, where Luiselli started working as a volunteer in 2015. "My task here," Luiselli writes, "is a simple one. I interview children following the intake questionnaire and then translate their stories from Spanish into English. The task may be simple, but reality is not. The children's stories are shattered beyond the repair of a narrative order. The problem with trying to tell their story is that it has no beginning, no middle, and no end." According to Luiselli, the 40 questions addressing minor migrants reveal a cold, cynical, and very brutal reality, from the first question, "Why did you come to the United States?" to the last one, "Who would take care of you if you were to return to your home country?" Between April 2014 and August 2015, more than 100,000 children were detained at the US border, And this essay analyzes the existing procedures regarding these children and the various circumstances that led to their travel and displacement. To Luiselli, the children who cross the border are not immigrants or illegals or undocumented minors, but they are, quote, refugees of war, and as such, they should have all the rights to asylum, end quote. The stories are chaotic. Trauma, extortion, mistrust make it difficult to make sense of the children's experiences. But Luiselli fills out all the intake questionnaires and together with the young migrants builds a defense against deportation. Due to the fact that she did not herself have a green card at the time when she was doing this, she had to stop working as an interpreter, and she characterizes her in this essay then as a non-resident alien. Just as the migrant, she needs a permit to stay and work in the US. 2 years later, in 2019, Luiselli reuses the material of the essay in the multi-layered novel Lost Children Archive. On the one hand, this is an intertextual novel and an autofiction based on explicitly mentioned sources. The novel tells about a young family traveling to the south of the US while documenting stories of minor migrants as well as of native Indians. On the other hand, the novel is a portrait of a marriage and finally leads to the breaking up of the couple. The novel ends, as you can see, with Polaroids of a journey. These pictures, in a Sebald-like way, seem to express that the act of bearing witness is the drive behind the telling of stories. But witnessing will never lead to immediate representation and understanding. Whereas in Roy's work, fiction and non-fiction were distinguished, in Luiselli's case, essay and novel are strongly interwoven. The consequence being that stories are echoed, retold, and recontextualized. Luiselli tries to find out which genre works best for telling the sad but real stories of loss and displacement. The novel is autofiction, travelogue, documentary, but in particular, it is a way to connect to the everyday life of a happy family, to connect that everyday life to the cruel experiences of families who have not so many chances. The novel offers a strategy to help readers identify with the political action. It is a way to make fiction urgent and timely. In line with Ngozi Adichie and Roy, Luiselli creates a hybrid form of literature in which certain political themes and societal failures are depicted. All three of these authors can be considered activists in the sense that they strive for social change. The implementation of the political in the literary work, the genres and style of writing evidently is different. They do it in a different way. The public performance of the writers is different as well, but all three of them do consider themselves as political, engaged, and in more or less graduations as activists. I briefly discussed 3 cases of political activism and I would like now to start my reflection on the concept of cultural authority. As Stephen Collini argued in Absent Minds, Intellectuals in Britain, cultural authority implies that the intellectual profile of writers is based on their prestige, which in turn is founded on their academic education and on their artistic achievement or body of work. This is what Collini explains. The operation of the cultural authority of the intellectual requires both an element of achievement in a particular intellectual creative activity and an element of acquiring a reputation for addressing a non-specialist public. The role of the intellectual is constituted by the movement between these 2 poles. So, Collini underlines that authority is connected to the intellectual part, the writing, as well as to the public part, the presence and performance. He further says, speaking out is crucial for public intellectuals. They have to be good at handling ideas, being more reflective, being able to set issues in a wider frame. The authority depends on the uncommanded response of those it affects. and the authority depends on the intervention in or acting upon the political sphere. I would add two reflections here. First, specific literary strategies, that is providing scenarios, doing narrative experiments, making an amalgamation of fiction and non-fiction, can have an extra effect in current media contexts. And second, in the fragmented public spheres in which there is more information available than ever before, but in which there also is a tendency to weaken open debate, public intellectuals as spokespersons can demonstrate how to entangle fake from real, obsession from observation, nostalgia from rationality, immediate reaction from retrospective thinking. That is a proficiency that can be connected to writing. In this context, I think it's relevant to mention the open letter that was sent earlier this week to Harper's Magazine. You probably have seen it. The letter on justice and open debate emphasized the value of strong and even ironic counter-speech from different perspectives, and also the possibility of good faith disagreement. And these writers wrote, a quote, "As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, for risk-taking and even mistakes." And it was signed by, among others, Ian Barrow, Noam Chomsky, Kamel Daoud, Margaret Atwood, Salman Rushdie, G.K. Rowling. So a lot of interesting authors who also have experienced the debate, I would say, in society. Let me now elaborate a bit on the media context that we are talking about, in which writers have a role. We could say that or we could argue that we live in an era of transforming democracies, or even of democracy as a fragile ecosystem. And in August 2019, an intriguing article appeared entitled "Nobody Understands Democracy Anymore." Shani Moore, the author, states in this article that many people today experience the public spheres in Western societies as confusing, as over-emotional, and too much influenced by fake information and the spectacle of social media. And as Moore underlines, democracy is said to be in decline. Scholars have discussed the crisis of liberal democracy, the against democracy statement, please do not let voters discuss difficult issues, they can't do it, and even the end of democracy. On the basis of various studies, Moore then concludes that disagreement is the most fundamental condition for a democracy, and disagreement should be legitimized and facilitated. Neither Twitter, nor cable news, nor referendums, nor high courts, nor the free market or authoritarian populist can replace proscribing norms for the organization of disagreement. So democracy depends on organization of disagreements, on rituals of debate in which disagreement is shared and discussed. And in this context, the role of the writer as public intellectual who can share, balance and counter ideas is crucial. Literary strategies can help to understand various positions, arguments and ideas. And in order to demonstrate this a bit further, I have two other very recent examples of literary writers positioning themselves in a debate in a very specific manner. The context today, of course, is that we're living in this strange coronavirus situation. And this is an interesting example from the Dutch public sphere. The novelist Ilja Leonard Vijver, he lives in Genoa in Italy for almost 8 years now. And in March, last March, he decided to write a diary on the city of Genova, an everyday note, a column in the important newspaper, the NRC. And he called it the viral diary. And as said, he described in a very precise, meticulous way the everydayness of the Italian city under quarantine. That people could not go anywhere. And 5 his daily columns, as said, there were 95 episodes. They appeared in this newspaper on a very prominent position. They did not count, of course, as regular news, but they added a very personal perspective to the news. And as such, they were, I think, very important. He published a public diary. He reacted and reported on a very unknown and specific situation, and we somehow got more information from him than from, let's say, the regular reporters. Another interesting example in this case is an interview with Elif Shafak in May 2020, just 1 month ago. It is published on YouTube. It's a bit strange what the channel is. It somehow is connected to to the European Parliament, to the Socialist Party. However, what Elif Shafak is explaining here is how she deals with Corona, how she reacts on it as a writer. She is a Turkish writer living in London. And she explains how she always kept to the phrase by Doris Lessing, literature is an analysis after the event. That was Lessing's quote. And now Shafak explains how she realizes that does not work anymore. She has to interrupt, she has to react. The age we are living in requires that we write during the events, now that the event is happening. And she also explains that she was working on a non-fiction book on populism, and she stopped writing that because Corona is so all over the place, and she has to react to that. I come to my conclusive part now and back to my argument on cultural authority related to political activism and the input of contemporary writers. My first conclusion is that cultural authority of writers is based on knowledge and performance. Authority implies power to influence others. It implies confidence of thinking and reliability of information. It does not mean, by the way, that every writer has a perfect insight in things and situations. It means that disagreement is made possible. If a writer is really interested in political situations, it should have an effect that they can deal with a disagreement with other opinions as well. Second conclusion, intellectual thinking that writing presupposes implies analysis, moral accountability, and a strive for distinguishing truth from false, nuance from conviction, engagement from detachment. And this is all based on the Habermasian idea of the public space as a place in which debates should be deliberative, that is funded on the careful weighing of different opinions, the careful movement of thought, and I underline that deliberation is the motor of democratic thinking. Deliberation implies that people do not have to agree, but that disagreement is organized so that you can share counterpoint ideas, thoughts, and arguments. And this is, of course, something that novelists, that literary authors understand very well. I would like to end with saying that it is in the investment of time, in the safeguarding of independence, and in the representation of people who are not in the news, that the writer as public intellectual builds persuasiveness and, in the end, cultural authority. And I would like to refer back to the words that Ruth Scobie used in her opening. We need these people in turbulent times. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers. That was a fabulous set of opening thoughts, taking us kind of all the way from the Chartists to COVID-19 in an hour. That's amazing. So I would ask then our audience to use the question and answer function. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens where you can write in any questions that you'd like to ask. And while we're waiting to see if people have questions, I wonder if I can kind of start us off. I mean, it's particularly, I was really pleased that you brought up that open letter and the kind of recent debate there, Odile, because I'm an 18th centuryist in my day job, and it's been very odd to me to see this kind of nostalgia in certain quarters for an idea of the kind of Habermasian public sphere that in my field is taken as an ideal which never really existed, that there's never been a time that like public debate really worked like that there wasn't bad faith and there wasn't kind of unequal access and there wasn't sort of the problem of fake news. And I think Simon's paper kind of pointed towards some of the problems there, that actually it wasn't a case of sort of cultural authority equals to some extent, if that makes sense. So I wonder if I want to talk about money and I want to talk about attention seeking. Those are my two things that I've written down and underlined. The idea of attention seeking, the trap of attention seeking, which is a phrase that Divya used. The problem, of course, is that a public intellectual has to be public. A public intellectual, in order to participate, has to be visible. And yet, as Divya's paper illustrated very vividly, that the idea of being attention seeking can be a weak point. It can be a focus of attack. Is that a kind of phrase, the idea of attention being both a kind of something you need in order for any of this sort of political change or kind of political voice to take place, and yet at the same time being kind of a vulnerability? Does anyone kind of, I haven't even phrased a question, but does anyone think that kind of, they could sort of think about that in terms of their own work and the writers that they've mentioned?
Yeah, I would. I think attention is a fantastic term, and it sort of is on the same level with my idea on visibility. So you have to be visible. You have to be. The public has to see you. You have to have an audience. You have to sell books in order to be known and to be heard. So that definitely is a very important term. And about your Habermasian idea, of course, it is an ideal, and you probably know that people were very negative about Habermas until maybe 3 years ago or so. Mm-hmm. It lasted and it lasted, and of course, he made the point that he did not have women authors and women speakers in his lens and so on. But my point is that there is much in Habermas that we can use today, and that is maybe a sort of old-fashioned idea maybe, but we have to organize the whole debate, several debates. And there is not one public sphere, mm-hmm. Of course, there are several public spheres and they are connected and so on. But what you see, I think, in social media context is that we are missing filters, or we are missing people who sort of are playing the role of the guard of the discussion, and then there is a lot of energy and ideas are slipping away. And in that context, the whole ideal indeed, but also idea of deliberation, mm-hmm. trying to sort of disagree with each other and see where it comes from and how we can organize it, how we can think the other perspective as well. That is, I think, a very important term. And that is what I like to bring back. And that is also why I think you need somehow a concept like authority. Authority is sort of in the same context, has something old-fashioned as well, because it means that it could suggest that you have more power than others. Mm. That is not at all what I'm sort of aiming at or striving at, but I think that some people can help others out in saying, okay, let's think together, or let's try what we can make of this. And that is somehow, I think, a role that I see happening in some authors. The Shafak interview is really interesting. It was not watched many times, only 500 times or something, but it is really interesting. But I think the position of an author and of a novelist who is capable of psychology and empathy and all the things that we mention in this context, the novelist can help other people in order to make something out of all the debates that are going on.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So I feel like both Simon and Divya will have things to say about this idea of authority. Divya, do you want to go next?
Okay. The notion of attention capital is a bit different when it comes to the case of Tagore, for example. But it's a little bit different when we talk about Jeyamohan. So it's a different kind of attention capital being created within the story. And it's not just linked to the public intellectual, the writerly intellectual. It's linked to something else in the society. So the cultural capital of a particular person, it could be because of his caste, or his social identity, his gender identity, that becomes more important than the writerly discourse. So it becomes more problematic in the Indian context. It's not very simple. Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, separating those two, it was always got to be very difficult, and it's going to work in different ways in different contexts, for sure. Yeah. Simon, I don't know if we take this back to...
Yeah, well, I mean, Chartism is interesting. I mean, as with any kind of mass movement, it depends on really sort of an appeal to the emotions. But Chartism itself saw itself as quite a kind of intellectual movement and a very literate movement. And it placed a lot of emphasis on autodidacticism amongst the working classes and things like that. So poetry is kind of a bridge, I think, between those two elements of the movement. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of the people who write Chartist poetry are actually leaders of Chartism. People like, Fergus O'Connor does a bit. Thomas Cooper of Leicester, who's the leader of the Leicester Chartism, becomes a national figure in Chartism partly through his poetry and song. So yeah, poetry kind of bridges the gap between intellectual debate and an appeal to feelings, appeal to the senses of the audience. I mean, as far as Vernon is concerned, though, I mean, he's certainly after attention, and I think that the Northern Star gives him this in to this kind of national audience, takes him beyond the limits of his own village at a time when he can't even get beyond the limits of his own house at first. He doesn't get his first wheelchair until I think November 1840. So it gives him that sort of in, but it also attracts attention of the wrong kind in terms of some of the local notables. Maybe he thought these people won't read the Northern Star, he'll get away with it. But obviously it gets to the ear of one of the local parsons, and he gets in trouble that way. So at some point, he's obviously faced with a choice. Do I continue to try to access this wider national audience, to put my message out there, or do I kind of knuckle under? And I think possibly the kind of failure to turn that attention in the Northern Star into hard cash that will help him to get his medical treatment is probably the point at which that decision is made. He gets a tenner out of the Queen and the Dowager Queen, which is a lot more than he gets from the readers of the Northern Star. So yeah, I think that it's a problematic thing for him personally, and that kind of the opportunity that it seems that the Northern Star gives him to kind of launch himself in a bigger way. He's very quickly brought down to earth by the reality of that.
Yeah, I love that line about the help is only from the Tory. That feels very much. I mean, that does seem to me to come back to Odile and Divya. It does seem to me to have something to do with the kind of contemporary debate, right? That the people who signed that open letter in Harper's mostly reasonably secure kind of financially, not in that position of kind of trying to find some sort of balance between this sort of freedom to speak out and the need to make a living. And of course, that's a big part of the kind of current debate, which is about precarity and poverty, and how does precarity and poverty shape who gets to participate in this kind of public intellectual activity, who gets to debate in this kind of public sphere. Odile, I don't know if you have a thought about that.
Yeah, I've thought about it. I'm not sure if I would immediately agree that all these people are successful and making a lot of money. I was interested in two names who signed as well, and one is Ian Buruma. He was the originally Dutch writer who had to quit from the New York Review of Books because the Me Too affair. He accepted something from a man. Well, in that he was fired in that context. And another author that I think is very interesting in this context is Kamel Daoud. Kamel Daoud, and he is an Algerian writer, very successful in France, but still, well, until a few months ago, living in Algeria. So he is not the person who is making a lot of money and can say something, well, something like this out of his chair or something. But I do think that the letter is interesting because from my perspective, it also is a very American perspective, I think. There is a sort of schism, I think, in right and left wing or conservative and democratic that is in the rhetoric of this letter. And that is quite different from what we experience here in the Netherlands or I think in the UK as well. So that is, but I find that very interesting. Because the letter was published, but it was immediately in all the newspapers here as well. So there is something going on that everyone thinks is interesting, and then not everyone is reading the letter and is really going into the letter and so on. So yeah, it's an interesting case for us to explore and to do.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's a real flattening effect as well in the way that social media connects up people from these different kind of cultures and specific circumstances that just kind of people leap to whatever their circumstances are as a kind of lens. We actually have a couple of questions now in the Q&A. The first one talking about Kanye West's presidential bid, and they say, I was interested in how Divya presented the mistrust of celebrity culture from both the radical position and from the kind of socially conservative stance. And then thinking about Kanye West's presidential bid, how does the panel hold open the radical and conservative aspects of the celebrity interventions they research? Is it possible for a writer to be both at the same time? So I think that's kind of linking to what you were saying, Odile, about these two sides, but essentially it's about kind of not a positioning, but a kind of a tone or a mode. Divya, I don't know if you have a position on Kanye West or on celebrity culture.
I don't know. I was just thinking about the money plot. I mean, in that story, if you look at the money plot, the writer has every right to demand his dues back. So that is the the premise of the money plot. But if you look at the caste plot and the gender plot, things become complicated. And I was thinking that no other male from any other caste can get this kind of reparation, MVV gets the reparations. He gets his dignity back, his money back, just because he belongs to that particular community. And there is a regressive writerly activism going on at the background as well. The kind of poetry that he comes up with, the religious poetry, that's quite frightening and threatening. So you don't see the intellectual, the philosophical, the really generous side of a writer coming through. So it becomes a bit muddied up. So there are several strands, crisscrossing that story. There is righteousness. He has to get his right dues back, but then there are other complications in the background as well. In terms of gender and caste. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but these are the thoughts that I have in terms of that issue.
No, that's great. Thank you. No, I'm just thinking about that, the word poet in capital letters as a profession. Like, who gets to claim that? Who gets to be a professional poet in capital letters?
Yeah, I mean, the poet in capital letters was interesting because it's the enumerator who writes that down, but it is kind of tempting to imagine that this was insisted on by by Vernon. I mean, I think in terms of being conservative and radical at the same time, aren't all progressives conservative in some way? And isn't that why they always fall out with each other? everybody comes up against the limits of everybody else's progressivism. But yeah, I mean, certainly with Vernon, I mean, you can see his poetry volume that he publishes is quite conservative with a small c. It's all about religion and morality and those sorts of conservative values, if one could say that. But at the same time, he's publishing all this stuff in the Northern Star, which is kind of railing against poverty and tyranny and these sorts of things. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. And again, it comes back to when you want to actually make some money out of this, you have to tone it down. You have to kind of, bury the more radical things. And it's not just Vernon. I mean, Vernon's in an extremely precarious position because of his disability. But actually, this is quite a common pattern with Chartists who start writing poetry as Chartists and then decide they want to publish a volume. And in order to get the amount of money they need to just get published, if they're publishing by subscription, they have to kind of tone it down for a more general audience. So it's
there's the kind of incompatibility of the two sides. And a second question, which I think is related, was about from Renika Chakrabarti. What are your thoughts on how grassroots writers, artists, etc., operating at the fringes of society, which I think would certainly include, in some ways, Vernon, can use their voices to represent the underrepresented? And this person is also thanking you for 3 fantastic talks. Does anyone have any thoughts on the idea of kind of representation? Can that be done by someone? Do you need to be of the same identity to represent somebody, or how does?
I'll have a go at a little bit of a response. I mean, I think that with Vernon, certainly there is empathy between his own situation. He's somebody who's experienced poverty for very different reasons to the poverty of the industrial regions of Britain in the 1840s, but he knows what poverty is. He also has sympathy with the incarcerated. He knows what loss of liberty is. He knows what being confined to a room is. Maybe he's a poet for the lockdown generation. Who knows? But he has that sort of sympathy in that way. But I don't know if he would see himself as kind of representative in any way. Partly, I mean, his disability does make him quite unusual, even within a society when disabilities of various kinds are, quite common and probably quite visible because of industrial accidents and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure about how representative he saw himself in that sense.
Whether that's is that a useful term, I suppose, is the question. The other thing I was going to ask about, because I've been doing so much English literature teaching recently, is genre and form. Because we always end up talking, and it did strike me that you were talking, Simon, about sonnets, and then about short stories, and about novels and essay collections, and I wondered if the kind of politics of particular literary forms are important to the way that these writers are kind of working. I know that, like, Roy, for example, has sort of debated whether or not a novel is something that can sort of have this political voice, or whether it's sort of fundamentally dishonest in some ways. I know that, like, poetry is so important in the 19th century to political debate in a way which we probably wouldn't see it now.
Oh, go on, I'll have a little go again. Well, certainly in the 19th century, literary interventions in public debate were quite common. I mean, if you look at the 1840s and 50s in particular, you've got the condition of England novel genre. You've got people like Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell and even Benjamin Disraeli getting in on that particular act, and as well as a host of lesser known writers as well. So novels were seen as an important vehicle for testing various positions in public debate, various solutions for social problems. Poetry is quite seen as quite a democratic sort of idiom, I suppose. It's a lot easier and quicker to write a poem than it is to write a 300-page novel or a 100-page political tract. So actually it's seen as quite a good way for the disempowered to get a voice. So working class men, women, they will sort of get involved in writing poetry in order to have a input into political debate. So that's why it becomes quite a kind of mainstay of the Northern Star newspaper to have this poetry column, almost, you know, from quite early on.
I think that I would add to that I think that in much recently published literature, the whole idea of this is that genre and this is another, or this is fiction and this is non-fiction, is disappearing and is not that important or that interesting anymore. Mm-hmm. Luiselli was a very interesting case, I think, because the novel was almost, well, completely based on the essay. So she was trying to make it into something, well, what is a novel? Something fictional. And then you see that it did not even work all the times, but it's a very interesting experiment. And I think that even in Roy's case, she tries to, this is a novel, something different than the non-fiction, and the Seditious Heart is explicitly non-fiction. And then she also talks about using literary methods in the non-fiction, and so it comes together. And certainly Adichie is a case in which it is a very, everything is connected as well. There are even blocks in Americana, she uses blocks, and then the blocks that the protagonist is writing are blocks on the website of Adichie. So she's completely taking the boundaries away, taking them out. And I think that is very much literature as it is written today. It's a very interesting thing, I think.
Thank you all very much indeed for such thought-provoking papers and your answers to the questions. And thank you very much to everyone for tuning in. And also to Sandra and Jenny, who've been overseeing the technology from Vienna. There's a particularly international panel, like, coming from 4 different countries, I think, today. So I'd just like to remind everybody that next week's panel will be the same time on Friday, with Ellen Wiles and Benedict Schofield, who are going to be talking about literary political networks and institutions. So kind of moving on from individuals to institutional and possibilities for literature and change. You can find details of that and a link to register. There's Ben. Hi, Ben. Nice to see you. And hope to see you next week. So if you look on the Torch website, there's a link to register and further information. So thank you all again, and have a very good weekend.